All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development Program, and in particular the AWD1100 C# Programming Language Fundamentals class, I've been doing a series of video presentations based on the textbook for the class, which, as you can see, is Muroc C# 2015. I have finished the 3 chapters in Section 1, an Intro to Visual Studio, the 8 chapters in Section 2, the C# Language Essentials, and I'm now to the last chapter, 16, of Section 3 on Object-Oriented Programming, one of the shortest, if not the shortest, chapters in the book. Then we'll move on to database programming, more skills for working with data, and enhancement and deployment. So, Chapter 16, Onward and Upward. There are only 17 slides, so this will only take a few minutes, hopefully. So, how to organize and document your classes. Notice we have 2 applied objectives: add XML documentation to classes, create and use a class library, and 4 knowledge objectives. Describe 2 ways you can code 2 or more classes in a single file. Describe the benefits of creating and using a class library. Describe the use of namespaces, and describe the use of partial classes. All right. So, it is legal to code classes, multiple classes, in a single file. When 2 classes are closely related, sometimes it makes sense to code them in the same file, especially if each class is relatively small. All right. What that does is it gives you less files in your project. So one way to code 2 classes is to code them one after another, as shown in the example here. Another way is to nest a class within another class. So you've got an inner class. This is useful when one class is used only within the context of another class. To refer to the nested class, you have to qualify it with the name of the class it's nested in. So you have to say, like, let's see, outer class here, outer class dot inner class, for example. All right, you can also split a class across multiple files. And to do this, you use what are called partial classes. Notice they both say public partial class customer. So partial classes can be used to split the code for a class across several files. To do this, you enter the partial keyword before the class keyword. All partial classes must belong to the same namespace and the same assembly. If a class you're working with becomes very long, you may want to do this. Visual Studio uses partial classes to separate the code that's generated for a form class from the code that's entered by the programmer, for example. All right, as shown here. Now, a namespace is a container that can be used to group related classes. It's kind of like a folder. In most cases, all of the classes that make up a project are part of the same namespace. The namespace statement appears near the beginning of the source file, and it identifies the namespace that the classes defined in that file belong to. All right. By default, when you add a class to a project, it's added to the namespace with the same name as the project. You can nest namespaces, so you can have a namespace within a namespace. One way to do that is to include a namespace statement within the body of another namespace, as shown right here. Another way is to code the fully qualified name of the nested namespace in a namespace statement, like we have right here. To use a class in a namespace other than the current namespace, you must provide a using directive that uses the other namespace, or names it, like we've got here. Now, as far as documenting your classes, Notice that when you start a comment with slash slash, it gets green, and that's a regular comment. When you start a line with 3 slashes, you're making what's called an XML comment. All right. In XML documentation line, each begins with a start tag, things like summary, or value, or returns, or param name. All right. The summary, as it says, provides a general description, kind of a prologue or whatever you'd want to say. Value describes the value of a property. Returns describes the return value. And param describes the parameters. These are much like Java doc comments if you've ever worked with Java. So if you type 3 slashes on a line, immediately preceding a class or member declaration, Visual Studio will automatically generate empty elements for you, and you can fill in the information as need be. What you are doing with this is you are providing internal program documentation. All right, I can tell you from my own experience, I have never had a person where I've created code and somebody else who's taken up the maintenance of it come up to me and say, boy, Jeff, I wish you wouldn't have put so much documentation in there. Okay. All right, as far as viewing documentation, the XML documentation that you add to a class is visible in the screen tips that are displayed in the code editor. All right. There's a couple of examples here. All right. Next, the creation and the usage of class libraries. All right. A class library provides a central location for storing classes that are going to be used by 2 or more applications. Think about it like a regular library. All right, a regular library holds books. Why? So that multiple people can check them out and use them, read them, etc. So far, all the classes that we've created have been part, of like a Windows form project or whatever. But we've used them all for the same thing, for the same project. If we want to be able to use classes for multiple projects, all right, we create a class library. So a class library consists of a collection of related classes. When you use this library, you can use any of the classes in the library without copying them into the project. When you modify a class in the class library, the changes are immediately available to all applications that use that library. So to create a library, you develop a class library project. Then, when you build the project, Visual Studio creates a DLL, or dynamic link library file, for the class library. It's this DLL that you refer to from any application that needs to use the class library. So they show an example here, albeit maybe not the best one in the world. All right? So to create a class library project, you display the new project dialog box. All right. And you get that by right-clicking here. And then you select the class library template. You enter a name and a location for the project. By default, the class library project will include a single class named Class 1. You can modify this, delete this, add other classes, using the project add class command, etc. You can even bring in classes from another project using the project add existing item command. You should create a namespace for the class library that indicates the purpose of the classes in the library. To compile a class library project, you select the release option from the solution configuration combo box. Once you do that, you can use a using directive, as really is shown, I guess, here. And that will simplify your access to the class library. So you add the reference to the class library to your project by right-clicking the References folder in the Solution Explorer and selecting Add Reference. Now, as an example, not only can you put your own in there, but you can put in other ones. I just very quickly want to show you, this is something that I'm working on for a different class. But that said, here are my references right here. All right, I can close that. But if I right mouse click, I can choose Add Reference. Now, as an example, C# does not have what's called an input statement. All right. However, Visual Basic.net does have an input statement. So if I wanted to be able to use, all right, I could go in there and browse projects. I could browse shared projects. I could browse COM, etc. And if I found in here something I wanted to use, like Microsoft Visual Basic or something, I could add that by just checking right here, clicking the OK button, and it would add it to over here into my list of references. Then I'd be able to use it. And I can do that whether it is my library or it's an existing class library. So that's it. When I come back in just a few minutes, I believe I should still have time to start with chapter 16, I think it is. No, that's the one I'm on. So, File, Open. I want to get into 17, which will be the beginning of the database section. I did want to mention one thing about this. All right? Okay. And that is, I'm going to jump back to here. I am going to go over all 4 of these chapters. I'll spend the most time on chapter 1 and very little time on 18, 19, and 20. In my humble opinion, using data sources, data sets, bound controls, parameterized queries, and AWD.net is the, quote, more old-fashioned way of doing this. So we'll talk about it, but just how long these lectures are remains to be seen. But I will, when we get down to chapter 24, and we talk about using the entity framework, there I will go through 2 complete projects that will hopefully help you. Plus, I'll spend quite a bit of time on chapter 23, which is a lead into this because it's on link. How much time we'll spend on files and XML files, again, remains to be seen, as is how much time we'll spend on these 2 chapters. Today is Wednesday, the 27th of November, the day before Thanksgiving. My hope is by the end of next week, which is around December 6th, I will be done with the 10 chapters that I have left, so I can go on and start working on other classes. Okay, we'll see how that works. And I'll be back with chapter 17 shortly.